So, the Great Nirvana. So I'm going to begin with two readings. The first reading is attributed to Shakyamuni Buddha. Nirvana is deathless. Those who have passed into Nirvana are deathless. I say that anybody who is endowed with careful assiduity is not compounded, and even though they involve themselves in compounded things, their true self does not age, does not die, and does not perish. The second reading is by Sifu Bruce Lee, another huge influence on me. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, and it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, and it becomes the teapot. Now, water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend. So, in honor of those two readings, I'm going to share with you a metaphor. And that metaphor is the chemical compound known as H2O. Now, some of you may know that H2O is made up from one oxygen atom and then two atoms of hydrogen. It's colorless, odorless, and has no real taste, despite what some people think. And it can take on many shapes and forms. And what's unique about it is that its bonding is such that the electrons allow a complete balance of attractive and repulsive forces, yin and yang. And of course, as we all know, water is life. There's breath and there's water. That is life. So I'm going to use H2O to kind of use as a metaphor. So I believe everyone can experience nirvana. I have tasted nirvana, undoubtedly. And when I think about nirvana and I think about the experience of nirvana, because I think it's easier to talk about it as an experience than a subject. And my experience of it, it has three things: boundless grace, abiding love, and abundant life. When I have tasted or experienced nirvana, these were the things that came through. And of course, not just for me. So, when H2O is a gas, we call it steam, the hydrogen bonds are broken. Now, I thought that was an interesting metaphor for the idea of boundless nirvana as boundless grace. So when we experience grace, we become unbound and truly free. We are born Buddha. It is a gift freely given. So we can't earn it and we can't lose it. It is the ultimate reality, the fundamental ground of consciousness as a transmundane reality or state. And they call this the eternal vijnana. And I think of this as nirvana within, also known as dharma dhatu. I think of that Buddha nature, which we all have, which we all are, is the true source of our strength. That when I'm going through my daily life, I always have to sort of mindfully remember that, because my ego self wants to take the reins. When a problem comes up or something I don't like has happened, which for some reason happened a lot in the last month, My ego self wants to get right in there and figure it out. Oh, I'll do it. And of course, my ego self ultimately can't do it and usually makes a mess of it. And it's in those moments where I must practice mindfulness, the original meaning. I must remember I am Buddha. I must remember that is the ground of my being. And that's the original meaning, by the way, of the word mindfulness, to recollect or remember your true nature. So it is the source of our strength. And when I hand things over to my true self, everything gets a lot easier. And in the process of doing that, my ego self isn't destroyed or cast off. My ego self is transmogrified by that experience. So that in some small way, people experience that through me as you. The second is the idea, or the experience rather, of nirvana as abiding love. Now, abiding is something we use a lot in Buddhism. If you're not familiar with that, and I'll explain that briefly. But let me go back to my H2O metaphor. So when H2O is a solid, we call it ice. Now what happens? The hydrogen atoms bond together. So in the steam, they're free. In ice, they bound themselves to each other. And so, when we abide in love, when we awaken to our interconnectedness, we see through the delusion of separateness. And this is the attaining, according to the Buddha, of persisting immortality and the gaining of a deathless sphere from which there is no falling back. Acutta pada. And this is nirvana, and I'll come back to this. This is nirvana as sukh abhati. So when I talk about abiding, are you guys familiar with the Brahma Vihara? Now, that's okay. The Brahma Vihara is one of the most basic teachings that'll be found in the oldest so-called records of Shakyamuni. And in fact, whoever practices the four abidings was guaranteed nirvana. Before mentioning anything to do with meditation or anything to do with mindfulness beyond recollecting your true nature, the four abiding practice, the four abidings, the divine abidings, that's what Brahma Vihara means. This was the way. There is a great scholar from Oxford who has spent his entire life studying the Pali texts and the Kayas and the Agama Sutras. And this is what he came up with. He said, this is the foundation. So if you want to experience nirvana, it begins with loving kindness for oneself and for others. Then it moves into compassion for oneself and for others. But here's the important thing to remember. Compassion is not an emotion in the viharas. Compassion is an action. I see you're suffering. I don't want you to suffer. I do something to help. That's compassion. So I can be compassionate towards people I don't even like because it's not about emotion. And this then leads to joy, upekkha, sympathetic joy, some people call it. But I like the word for word translation, joy in the joy of others. And this is a joy that is not mine privately. This is the joy I experience through others. Now, if you're a parent, when you see your child doing well, you experience this. But cultivating this for all beings, this is the way. joy in the joy of others. And the truth is, when we see somebody doing really well, it's a mixture. There's a little bit of envy, especially if we're not doing well. and there's, a little bit of jealousy and that sort of thing. And there's like, oh yeah, I'm so happy for you. I wish my life was better, right? Joy in the joy of others is not that. Joy in the joy of the others is a pure embrace. Good on you. And I relate it to compassion this way, that when I see someone do something great, now I didn't watch the Super Bowl, maybe some of you guys did. I'm sure there were some great catches and throws in that game. When I see someone do something wonderful like that, I say, wow, look what I did. Aren't I amazing? You see, because there's no separation. Now, when it comes to compassion, it's the same thing, but it's a little harder. When you see someone do something evil, destructive, you also say, wow, why did I do that? And so the abidings bring both parts of that awareness. And then the final abiding is equanimity. And this means that loving kindness, compassion, and joy is something that is experienced and expressed with all beings without prejudice. And those who abide in these will experience nirvana. So this, the first one was nirvana as something within our strength. I think of this one as nirvana as joy. And we talk about it as Sukh Abhati, or the true country. And this is the idea that nirvana is not just an experience, but it is a reality that transcends all reality. When I was younger, and I've been studying the Dharma since I was 10, so now I'm 62, I used to think of it like a metaphor, which it certainly is. But I must tell you, the longer I practice, the more I know it is real, and it is more real than this. And finally, nirvana as abundant life. So when H2O is a liquid, we call it water, the hydrogen now, the atoms do what? Move freely. Right? So first they're unbounded, then they bond together, and now they move freely. And so, as Bruce Lee taught us, be water. As we learn to be water and learn to flow mindfully in daily life, nirvana can be experienced because it already dwells as the inmost consciousness of the human being. It already dwells. It is consciousness which, according to Shakyamuni, is not subject to birth and death. And I think of this as nirvana now. Another word for it is bodhicitta. And to me, this is the gentle way of living. Gentleness. We talk about gentle men or gentle women. What do we mean by that? Well, we know it's noble. We know it's noble. And that's why, that's all right. It was that good of a talk, you just lost your control. And that's why the path was known as the noble path. Because this type of living, this type of being water, what does that mean exactly? It means to me, and we just had a martial arts class earlier talking about this, it's the idea that when you become like water, the obstacles are no longer something you think about, right? We were talking about martial art about how the evolution is you begin, you have opponent, right? Opponent you're dealing with. Then the second stage is you forget the opponent. And the third stage, you forget everything. There is no opponent, there is no self. And you become like water. So whatever it is, if it's a milk and cranny, it fills it up. It goes around it, or it slowly wears it down. You know, I remember when we were in Japan, and my son, at age 12, received his Shuzo ordination at Shitonoji. There was a famous boulder there that had a drop of water that dripped on it every day, and it was there for centuries. And now it was just this little stone. So I hope that that analogy or metaphor was fun. But I think of those three ways as the main ways of practice. The first is to recollect and remember that I am Buddha. I am true self. And to, when I get stuck or I get hooked, to recollect that and reorient myself. And in my daily life, to practice the four abidings, to experience that loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And then finally, in my daily life, when I do get stuck or hooked, to deal with it like water. I think of our four directions and the four questions in particular as like water moving away obstructions. And when we move away the obstructions, everything becomes clear. And I will say this, if you are guided through the four questions and the four directions, the Shiho Musubi, that we practice uniquely, you will experience nirvana. Might be just a little taste, a little glimmer, but you will. I guarantee it. If you do it under the right guidance and you follow each step, somewhere along there, it will happen. Every time. Every time. So at the end of the day, I don't want you to think of nirvana as something far away or something that only happens at the end of life. Now, this celebration we do tonight is Shakyamuni's death. He was a human being. He died, about 80 years old. We call it parinirvana, or the great nirvana, because he experienced nirvana when he had his awakening and throughout his life. But when he died, the idea is that is final nirvana. And what that means is that's how we look at things. So when someone dies, they now become Buddha. Now, I don't know what happens to them after they die. Perhaps they go through another 100,000 incarnations of some sort, or another 20,000 experiences. The universe is infinitely patient. Whatever our crap is, we'll work it out. But for us, it's already all happened. When we look at someone who has passed, it's already all happened. They're Buddha. That's easy to do with someone that you loved. A little harder to do with someone that you didn't. So when we practice the parinirvana, we do that for all beings, because we know that the destiny of all beings is Buddha. So it's very interesting. So what we're doing here is we're especially remembering Shakyamuni's, but it's the idea that death frees us from the bondedness of compoundedness. Let's celebrate the great nirvana.